believed in love, the kind that made hearts race, the kind that turned ordinary moments into cherished memories. At 25, she was deeply in love with Isaac, a man who embodied everything she had ever dreamed of in a partner. Their love story was the kind that inspired songs and whispered admiration among their neighbors in their small town in eastern Nigeria. Isaac was ambitious, hardworking, and deeply in love with Sandy. He had spent the last 5 years building his business, a growing trading company that specialized in importing spare parts from China. Though young, he had managed to establish himself as a respected businessman, known for his honesty and generosity. Everyone believed he and Sandy were meant to be. Their wedding was set for December, and Sandy had already picked out the lace fabric for her traditional attire. Her mother, Mama Nkechi, had begun collecting yams and palm oil for the festivities. The entire town buzzed with excitement, knowing that theirs was a union blessed by both love and destiny. Then tragedy struck. On a rainy evening in September, Isaac was returning from Enugu after closing an important business deal. The roads were wet, the traffic heavy, and the unexpected happened. A trailer, its brakes failing, swerved into his lane. The impact was instant. The car was crushed beyond recognition. Isaac was pronounced dead at the scene. When Sandy received the news, she thought it was a cruel joke. She refused to believe it, clutching onto the hope that there had been a mistake. But when she arrived at the morgue and saw his lifeless body, the world around her collapsed. Everything after that was a blur. The funeral came too quickly, the sympathizers too many. Her mother held her as she wailed, but nothing could fill the hollow ache in her chest. The man she had planned a future with, the one who had promised her forever, was gone. Days turned into weeks, and the weeks dragged into months. Yet Sandy's grief remained an open wound. She refused to step into a church again, unwilling to worship a God who had let Isaac die. How could he take away the one person who made her world make sense? She stopped praying, stopped hoping, stopped living. Her friends tried to console her, urging her to return to normal life, but normal no longer existed. Even her mother's tender words could not reach her. She withdrew from everything, stopped visiting friends, stopped taking care of herself, and even quit her job at the local library. Each morning she woke up to the unbearable weight of reality. Isaac was gone, and with him, the future she had envisioned. The wedding dress she had once admired now lay discarded in a box, gathering dust. The wedding invitation cards remained unopened in her drawer, mocking her pain. Some nights she sat by her window staring into the darkness, wondering if grief had a limit. Would she ever wake up one day and feel whole again? Her mother worried endlessly, begging her to go back to church, to at least pray, but Sandy would not. The bitterness in her heart had grown roots. She wanted nothing to do with faith anymore. 6 months after Isaac's passing, Sandy's world remained unchanged, but life around her moved on. The market women still shouted their prices, children still played in the streets, and people still got married. It was in this rhythm of life that David Okonkwo entered the picture. He moved into the apartment next to hers one quiet afternoon. Sandy barely noticed at first. She had mastered the art of ignoring the world. But David was not someone one could ignore for long. At 30, he carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. He was tall, dark-skinned, and had the calmest eyes she had ever seen. He wasn't overly friendly, nor was he intrusive, but there was something about him that unsettled her. Maybe it was the way he greeted her with a polite smile every morning, even when she barely acknowledged his presence. He was different from the others. While her neighbors whispered about her tragedy, he never pried. He never offered forced words of comfort or tried to push her into conversations she wasn't ready for. He simply existed, a steady presence, in the background of her grief. One day, as she struggled to carry a heavy bag of groceries up the stairs, David appeared beside her. "Let me help you," he said. taking the bag from her before she could protest. She wanted to tell him no, that she was fine, but the truth was, she wasn't. And for the first time in a long while, she accepted help. That small interaction opened the door to more encounters. A nod here, a brief exchange there. He never pushed, never pried, but his patience was unwavering. It was on a particularly lonely evening, as she sat outside watching the sunset, that he finally spoke beyond pleasantries. "I lost my wife," he said softly, looking straight ahead. Sandy turned to him, caught off guard. "She was everything to me," he continued. "Breast cancer. Took her before we could even have kids." Sandy swallowed hard. She hadn't expected that. For a long moment they sat in silence, two strangers bound by the same pain. That night, for the first time in months, Sandy didn't feel entirely alone. The following days after David's revelation were different. His words lingered in Sandy's mind, stirring emotions she had buried deep. She had assumed she was the only one carrying such heavy grief. But here was a man who had also lost love. Yet he still managed to wake up every day, still managed to smile, still managed to live. She didn't know what to make of it. She found herself observing him more. Unlike her, David had not let grief consume him. He had found a way to move forward. He still went to work every morning, still exchanged greetings with the neighbors, still attended church every Sunday. Yet, beneath all that, Sandy could see it. The weight in his eyes, the way he sometimes stared into the distance as though lost in memories, the way his laughter, though genuine, always carried an undertone of something else. One evening, as the sun set over the town, casting a golden hue over the rooftops, Sandy found herself sitting outside again. The air was cool, and for the first time in a long while, she wanted company. She glanced at David's door, debating with herself before finally gathering the courage to call out, "David?" He emerged a moment later, surprised but pleased. "Yes?" She hesitated. "Do you want to sit?" He smiled, one of those gentle, understanding smiles that made her feel safe. "Of course." They sat side by side, watching the last light of the day fade into the horizon. "Tell me about her," Sandy said suddenly, surprising even herself. David didn't respond immediately. He exhaled slowly before speaking. "Her name was Joy. We met in university. She was studying microbiology and I was in architecture. She was the kind of person who made you believe in goodness, in kindness. I never met anyone like her before or since." Sandy listened as he spoke about Ifeoma, how she loved dancing in the rain, how she would wake up early just to watch the sunrise, how she never let him go a day without praying. "She made faith seem easy," David admitted. "Even when she got sick, even when she knew she wouldn't make it, she never lost hope. She told me, David, when I leave, don't let my death take away your life." Sandy swallowed the lump in her throat. "Did it?" "For a while," he said honestly. "But I realized something. If I stopped living, then I'd be letting grief win. And she wouldn't have wanted that." Silence stretched between them. Sandy thought about Isaac, about how he had always loved life, about how he had wanted her to be happy. "What about you?" David asked gently. "Tell me about Isaac." She hesitated, but then the words came. She told him about how they met in secondary school, how he used to walk her home every day, how he always smelled like vanilla and citrus. She spoke of the way he had laughed, loud and unrestrained, as though he had never known sorrow. "He was my future," she whispered. "And when he died, I felt like my future died with him." David looked at her then, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. "But you're still here, Sandy." She looked away, her throat tight. That night she lay in bed replaying the conversation over and over. For the first time, she had spoken about Isaac without breaking down. And for the first time in a long while, she wondered, was there still a future for her? Days turned into weeks, and an unspoken understanding grew between Sandy and David. They never explicitly planned their evening conversations, yet they always seemed to find each other at sunset, sitting outside and sharing stories, some about their pasts, some about random things like favorite childhood memories or embarrassing moments. It was the most human Sandy had felt in months. One evening, after returning from the market, Sandy saw David watering the small garden in front of his apartment. He looked so at peace, so content. She envied that. "You garden?" she asked, stopping a few feet away. David looked up, grinning. "I try. Joy was the real gardener, but I do my best." She watched as he carefully tended to the plants. "What do you do when they start dying?" she asked softly. David wiped his hands on his jeans before responding. "I trim the dead parts, water them, and wait. Sometimes they come back. Sometimes they don't." Sandy felt something stir inside her. "And if they don't, then I plant something new." She nodded, his words settling deep inside her. That evening, as she prepared to sleep, she found herself whispering a prayer. It was small, just a few words, but it was more than she had said in months. She didn't know if God was listening. She didn't know if she even wanted him to. But something inside her was shifting. A week later, something happened that surprised even Sandy. It was a Sunday morning, and she woke up feeling different. She wasn't sure what it was, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel as heavy. She got up, showered, and as she dried her hair, she heard the sound of footsteps outside. She looked out the window and saw David, dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark trousers, holding a Bible. He was going to church. Sandy had not stepped into a church since Isaac's funeral. The thought of it made her stomach twist, yet as she watched David walk down the street, a strange longing crept into her heart. Before she knew what she was doing, she grabbed a simple dress and slipped it on. Her hands trembled as she reached for her sandals. She stepped outside just in time to see David turning the corner. Taking a deep breath, she followed. As she entered the church for the first time in months, she expected to feel anger, bitterness, pain, but instead, all she felt was quiet. And for the first time, she wondered if healing was possible after all. Sandy stood at the entrance of the church, her heart hammering violently against her chest. The building loomed before her, familiar yet foreign, a place she had once called home but had abandoned in her grief. She could still remember the last time she had been here, Isaac's funeral. The memory was sharp, the pain still fresh, but something inside her had urged her to follow David, to take this step no matter how small. She hesitated for a moment, gripping the fabric of her dress as if it could steady her. David had already walked inside, unaware of her presence. She could hear the soft hum of the choir, the voices blending in worship. Her feet felt heavy, as though they were rooted to the ground. What was she doing here? Would she find comfort, or would this place only remind her of what she had lost? Before she could turn back, David glanced over his shoulder, his eyes widening slightly in surprise when he saw her. He didn't say anything, he just smiled, a simple, warm smile that held neither judgment nor expectation. That was all it took. With a deep breath, she stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of burning candles and polished wood. The congregation was singing, their voices rising in unison, filling the space with a kind of reverence Sandy hadn't felt in a long time. She slipped into a seat at the back, trying to make herself invisible. The sermon began shortly after, and to her surprise, the pastor's words weren't about grief or loss. They weren't about death or sorrow. Instead, he spoke about healing, about restoration, about how broken things could be made whole again. Her fingers clenched against the seat. Was that even possible? Could she be whole again? She listened, but she didn't let the words sink in, at least not yet. But she was there, and for now, that was enough. After the service, Sandy made her way outside, eager to leave before anyone could approach her. She wasn't ready to face questions or well-meaning sympathies, but as she stepped onto the church steps, David was waiting. "You came," he said simply. She nodded, avoiding his gaze. "It wasn't as bad as I thought." "That's a start." They walked side by side in silence for a while. the town alive with the sounds of traders setting up their stalls, children running through the streets, and the faint aroma of roasting corn and fried plantains filling the air. David didn't press her for details, and for that she was grateful. Instead, he said, "Do you want to join me for breakfast?" Sandy hesitated. She had grown so used to being alone, to avoiding company, that the idea of sitting across from someone and sharing a meal felt strangely intimate, but she found herself nodding. They stopped at a small roadside eatery, where the scent of freshly made akara and pap wafted through the air. They ordered their food, and as they ate, they talked. Not about grief, not about church, but about ordinary things. David told her about his job as an architect, about how he had spent years working in Lagos before deciding he needed a quieter life. He spoke about his childhood, his love for books, and the little things that made life meaningful. Sandy found herself laughing at his stories, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in a long time. It felt strange. It felt good. And for a fleeting moment she forgot about the pain. As the days passed, Sandy found herself slipping into a new routine. She still had bad days, days where the weight of Isaac's absence felt unbearable, where she would wake up expecting his call or reach for her phone to text him, only to remember he was gone. But there were also days when the pain wasn't as sharp. She started taking walks again, breathing in the crisp morning air, letting the sun warm her skin. She found herself talking to David more, sharing bits and pieces of herself that she had kept locked away. One evening, as she was cleaning her apartment, she came across a box. The box. Inside were all the wedding invitations that had never been sent out. The dress designs, the colour swatches for the bridesmaids' outfits, the pictures of the hall they had booked. It was all there, untouched, frozen in time. Sandy sank onto the floor, her fingers trembling as she picked up one of the invitations. "Mr. and Mrs. Jones request the pleasure of your presence at the wedding of their daughter Sandra." She pressed the card to her chest, a sob escaping her lips. She had spent so long avoiding these memories, pushing them aside, pretending they didn't exist. But they did. They were real. And so was her pain. She didn't know how long she sat there, but eventually there was a knock at her door. She wiped at her eyes, pulling herself together before opening it. David stood there, concern etched in his features. "I was passing by and saw your light on. You okay?" She wanted to say yes. She wanted to lie. But something in his gaze made her stop. "No," she whispered. Without a word, he stepped inside and sat beside her. He didn't ask questions. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He just sat there. And for the first time, Sandy realized that maybe she didn't have to carry this weight alone. The days turned into weeks, and Sandy found herself doing something she never thought she would. She started decluttering. It wasn't easy. Every item she picked up held a memory, a piece of a life that had been stolen from her. But David's words echoed in her mind. Trim the dead parts, water the ones that remain. So she started small. She packed away the wedding invitations, tucked them into a box, and placed them in the back of her closet. She gave away some of the decorations they had bought, donating them to a women's shelter that was planning a small wedding for one of their residents. She didn't throw anything away, not yet. She wasn't ready for that. But she was moving, one step at a time. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she would be okay. Sandy sat by her window staring at the changing hues of the evening sky. The town was quiet, the distant chatter of traders packing up their stalls fading into the night. A soft breeze rustled through the leaves outside, carrying with it the distant sound of a church choir practicing their hymns. She had spent the last few weeks unpacking pieces of her grief, some small, some heavy, but tonight, the weight returned, pressing against her chest like a stone. She had been doing better. She knew that. She had allowed herself to talk about Isaac, to laugh again, to step into church without feeling suffocated. But healing was not a straight road, and tonight, the shadows of yesterday loomed over her again. With a sigh, she reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over an old contact Isaac. She hadn't been able to delete it, not because she expected him to call, but because letting go felt like erasing him. His voice, his presence, his love, it was all she had left, and she feared that if she let go, she would forget. A soft knock on the door pulled her out of her thoughts. She hesitated before opening it, and there stood David holding a small food flask. His presence was becoming familiar now, a steady comfort she had once resisted but had slowly begun to welcome. "I made jollof rice," he said with a grin, lifting the flask. "But I made too much, so I figured you could help me eat it." Sandy arched a brow, arms crossed. "And let me guess, you accidentally made too much yesterday too? And the day before that?" David chuckled, rubbing the back of his head. "Maybe I just like feeding people." She sighed but stepped aside, letting him in. He made himself comfortable at the small dining table, setting down the flask and 2 spoons. Sandy sat across from him, watching as he uncovered the steaming rice. The rich aroma filled the room, making her realize just how much she had neglected her appetite. As they ate, David spoke about his day, about a house he was designing for a client in town, about how the man wanted a swimming pool but didn't have enough land space. Sandy listened, nodding occasionally, but she knew David could sense her distraction. After a few moments of silence, he spoke softly. "Do you ever feel like grief comes in waves? Like just when you think you're swimming, another one crashes over you?" She froze, looking up at him. He was watching her, his expression understanding. "Yeah," she admitted. "Some nights it's like I'm drowning all over again." David nodded. "I feel that way too sometimes." Sandy swallowed, her grip tightening around her spoon. "Do you ever worry that moving on means forgetting them?" David exhaled slowly. "I did at first, but I realized something. Moving on doesn't mean forgetting. It just means carrying them differently." His words settled into her heart like a quiet truth. They ate in silence after that, but it was a comfortable one, and for the first time that evening, Sandy felt like she could breathe again. The next morning, Sandy woke up to the soft patter of rain against her window. The sky was overcast, a deep grey that mirrored the way she felt inside. She got up slowly, her body heavy with exhaustion. As she moved toward her dresser, something caught her eye, a small, unopened envelope tucked inside her jewelry box. Her breath caught in her throat. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Isaac. With trembling fingers, she picked up the letter. She had forgotten about it. It had been given to her the week before their wedding was supposed to happen, a letter he had written for her to open on the morning of their big day. She had never read it. For months she had avoided it, fearing the pain it would bring. But now, as she sat on her bed, she realized that she was finally ready. Slowly she opened the envelope, unfolding the paper inside. "My dearest Sandy, by the time you read this, we will be hours away from becoming husband and wife. I can't believe we made it here. From our awkward teenage years to our late-night talks about the future, I always knew it would be you. I always knew you were my forever. If I have learned anything from loving you, it's that joy isn't found in grand things, but in the little moments. The way you laugh when you're nervous. The way you always steal my food even when you have your own. The way you light up when you talk about books. Sandy, life is unpredictable, but if there's one thing I'm sure of, it's this. I want you to be happy. Always. Even if life doesn't go as we planned, promise me you will never stop seeking joy. Promise me you'll keep smiling, even on the hard days. You are my greatest blessing. Forever yours, Isaac." Tears blurred her vision as she clutched the letter to her chest. For months she had been drowning in sorrow, believing that happiness had died with Isaac. But here he was, even in death, reminding her to live. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, crying softly into the pages of the past, but when she finally wiped her tears, she felt lighter. She wasn't healed yet. She wasn't sure she ever would be. But maybe, just maybe, she could start trying. The next Sunday, Sandy made a choice. She woke up early, dressed in a simple blue gown and tied her hair into a loose bun. She looked at herself in the mirror, taking a deep breath before stepping outside. As expected, David was leaving for church dressed in a crisp white shirt and navy blue trousers. When he saw her, his eyes widened slightly in surprise. "You're coming?" he asked. Sandy nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." David's lips curved into a soft smile. He didn't ask questions. He simply offered his hand. She took it. And as they walked to church side by side, Sandy realized something. She wasn't alone anymore. The walk to church was quiet, yet filled with unspoken emotions. Sandy could hear her own heartbeat thudding in her ears as she stepped inside the familiar building. The scent of old wooden pews and candle wax filled the air, triggering memories she had long suppressed. The choir was already singing, their voices rising like incense to the heavens. She hesitated at the entrance, suddenly overwhelmed. This was the first time she had willingly come to church since Isaac's death. David must have sensed her hesitation because he gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Take your time," he whispered. She nodded and took a deep breath before stepping inside. They found a seat near the back, and as the congregation stood for worship, Sandy remained seated. The words of the hymn floated around her, but she couldn't bring herself to sing. She wasn't sure what she believed anymore. Hadn't she once stood in this very place praying for a future with Isaac? Hadn't she once whispered prayers of gratitude, believing that God had blessed her love story? Yet here she was, alone, grieving and questioning everything. Her eyes flickered to David, who stood beside her singing with his eyes closed, his face peaceful. How did he do it? How did he still trust in God after losing Iphioma? The sermon began and Sandy braced herself for another message about faith and hope, things she wasn't sure she wanted to hear, but the pastor's words caught her off guard. "Many of us believe that faith is about understanding everything," he said. "But real faith is trusting even when you don't understand. Real faith is believing that even in pain, even in loss, God has not left you." Sandy's fingers tightened around the fabric of her dress. She wasn't sure she was ready to believe that yet, but she was here. And maybe, just maybe, that was a start. Later that evening, Sandy found herself sitting on the floor of her bedroom, staring at a box she had tried to avoid for months. Her wedding dress. She had never even gotten to wear it. With hesitant fingers, she opened the box, pulling out the delicate lace fabric. It was beautiful, exactly what she had dreamed of. She ran her fingers over the embroidery, imagining what could have been. A lump formed in her throat. This dress represented everything she had lost. Tears blurred her vision as she hugged it close, her shoulders shaking. She had held onto this dress, onto this wedding, as if it was still possible. But it wasn't. Isaac was gone. Her future with him was gone. And yet, she was still here. The thought was terrifying. What was she supposed to do now? How was she supposed to build a future when she had no idea where to start? A knock at the door startled her. "Come in," she croaked, quickly wiping her tears. David stepped inside, his eyes immediately landing on the dress in her lap. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he walked over and sat beside her. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked softly. She shook her head, unable to find the right words. They sat in silence, the only sound being the occasional rustle of fabric as Sandy ran her fingers over the lace. Then David spoke. "You don't have to let go all at once," he said, "but you do have to take a step, even if it's just one." Sandy let out a shaky breath. "And if I don't know which step to take?" "Then take the smallest one," he said. "Even if it's just folding this dress and putting it away, even if it's just deciding to wake up tomorrow and try again." She looked at him then, her eyes searching his. "How do you do it?" "Do what?" "Keep moving forward," David exhaled, "because I know Joy would want me to. And deep down, I think Isaac would want the same For you. Sandy's eyes stung. She had spent so long being angry, so long holding on to the past, that she hadn't even considered what Isaac would have wanted for her. Would he want her to stay buried in grief? Or would he want her to live? Slowly she folded the dress and placed it back in the box. It wasn't much. But it was a step. Just as Sandy was beginning to find some peace, the past came knocking. She was walking back from the market one afternoon when she heard someone call her name. Sandy. She turned and her breath caught in her throat. It was Deb, Isaac's older sister. Deb had always been like a sister to Sandy. They had spent countless nights planning the wedding together, giggling over bridal magazines, talking about what their future as in-laws would look like. But after Isaac's death, their relationship had become strained. Sandy had cut off almost everyone connected to Isaac, unable to face the memories. Deb had tried to reach out at first, but when Sandy never responded, the calls stopped, and now, after all these months, she was standing right there. "Sandy, I've been looking for you," Deb said, stepping closer. Sandy swallowed. I'm sorry, Deb's eyes softened. "I understand, but I need to talk to you." Sandy hesitated. Part of her wanted to run to avoid this conversation, but another part of her knew that she couldn't keep running forever. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's talk." They walked to a quiet spot near a fruit stand, the scent of ripe mangoes filling the air. "I miss you," Deb said, her voice thick with emotion. "We all do. Mama keeps asking about you. She still calls you her daughter, you know." Sandy's throat tightened. She had loved Isaac's mother deeply, but she hadn't spoken to her since the funeral. "I didn't know how to face you all," Sandy admitted. "It hurt too much." Deb nodded. "I know. But running from us didn't take the pain away, did it?" Sandy looked down, ashamed. "You don't have to carry this alone," Deb continued. "You're still family, Sandy. If you ever need us, we're here." Tears welled in Sandy's eyes. Maybe it was time to stop pushing people away. Maybe it was time to start letting love back in. Sandy sat at the edge of her bed, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the embroidery on her bedsheet. The encounter with Deb had left her restless, her mind tangled in emotions she had long buried. Isaac's family had been her family. She had spent countless Sunday afternoons in their home, laughing with his mother, helping in the kitchen, listening to old stories about Isaac's childhood. And then, in an instant, she had cut them off. Too consumed by grief, too afraid of the memories they carried. Deb's words echoed in her head. "You don't have to carry this alone." For months she had believed that her grief was hers alone to bear, that no one could understand the depth of her loss. But Deb had lost Isaac too. His mother had lost a son. They had all been grieving, yet she had shut them out. The guilt settled heavily in her chest. For the first time since Isaac's death, she picked up her phone and scrolled to Mama Isaac's number. Her thumb hovered over the call button. Would she even want to hear from her? Had she already given up on Sandy the way Sandy had given up on everything? Before she could change her mind, she pressed call. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Sandy! It had been so long since she had heard that voice, so warm, so motherly, so full of love. Tears filled her eyes. "Mama." The line was silent for a moment, then a soft, trembling breath. "My daughter." Sandy choked on a sob. "I'm sorry. I should have called sooner. I didn't know how." "My child," Mama Isaac said gently, "grief does not come with a rule book. I never held it against you." Sandy wiped her tears. "I miss you. And I have missed you too." A pause. "Would you come and see me?" "You don't have to, but I would love to see you." Sandy swallowed hard. Returning to that house would mean facing everything she had run from. But deep down, she knew it was something she had to do. "Yes," she whispered. "I'll come." 2 days later, Sandy found herself standing at the familiar front gate of Isaac's family home. She hesitated. The last time she had been here, it had been for his wake. The memory was suffocating. White canopies, mourners dressed in black, the sound of wailing filling the air. She clenched her fists, grounding herself in the present. Before she could knock, the door opened, and Mama Isaac stood there smiling gently, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "My daughter," she said again, her voice filled with warmth. The next thing Sandy knew, she was enveloped in a tight embrace. She sank into it, inhaling the familiar scent of lavender and home-cooked meals. When they pulled apart, Mama Isaac took her hand. "Come inside." Sandy stepped over the threshold and into the living room. Nothing had changed. The same beige couches, the wooden coffee table, the framed photos on the wall, one of which was Sandy stepped over the threshold and into the living room. Nothing had changed. The same beige couches, the wooden coffee table, the framed photos on the wall, one of which was a picture of Isaac as a boy, grinning mischievously at the camera. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to breathe. "I made your favourite," Mama Isaac said, leading her into the kitchen. "Ofin sala with pounded yam." Sandy's lips trembled into a smile. "You remembered?" "I could never forget." They sat down to eat, and for the first time in months, Sandy allowed herself to talk about Isaac. Not as a lost love, not as a tragedy, but as the vibrant, joyful person he had been. And somehow, though the pain was still there, it didn't feel as suffocating anymore. Visiting Mama Isaac had been a turning point. It didn't erase the pain, but it reminded Sandy that she was not alone. That grief did not have to be carried in silence. She began making more conscious efforts to heal. She started journaling, writing letters to Isaac, letters she would never send but needed to write. She reconnected with old friends, went back to reading, and even started considering work again. And then there was David. She hadn't realized just how much he had become a part of her life. His presence had been constant, never overbearing, never demanding, just there. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset, David broke the silence. "You seem lighter these days," he observed. Sandy nodded. I think I'm learning how to live again," David smiled. "That's good." She glanced at him. "What about you? Do you still think about Ifeoma?" "All the time," he admitted, "but not in the way I used to. It's not painful anymore. It's just a part of me, a good part." Sandy was quiet for a moment. "I want to get there." "You will." She looked at him then, really looked at him. And for the first time she wondered, was it possible for her to love again? It was a quiet evening when Sandy found herself in the small bookstore near her home, browsing through the shelves absent-mindedly. She had started reading again, something she hadn't done in a long time. She picked up a novel and flipped through the pages when she felt someone's presence beside her. "Good choice," a familiar voice said. She turned to see David standing there, hands in his pockets, smiling at her. "You read romance novels?" she teased. David chuckled. "Only when I want to impress someone." Sandy laughed, shaking her head. But then the humour faded, and a different kind of silence settled between them. She didn't know what made her say it. Maybe it was the warmth in his eyes. Maybe it was the fact that for the first time she wasn't afraid of what came next. But she looked at him and whispered, "David, I think I'm ready to move forward." David's breath hitched slightly, his expression unreadable. Sandy swallowed. "I don't know what that means yet. I don't know if I can ever love someone the way I loved Isaac. But I know that when I'm with you, I feel safe. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I can breathe again." David was silent for a long moment before he spoke. "I don't want to replace him, Sandy. I just want to walk with you, wherever this journey takes you." Sandy blinked back tears. Maybe love wasn't about forgetting. Maybe it was about learning to carry the past while embracing the present. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. And just like that, another step was taken. The bookstore had been a turning point. Sandy had spoken words she hadn't even realized she was ready to say. But after the moment passed, doubt began creeping in. Was she really ready? Could she love again without feeling like she was betraying Isaac? That night she lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. David had been patient, never pressuring her, never expecting more than what she could give. And yet, deep down, she knew he had feelings for her. Was she being fair to him? She sighed, sitting up and hugging her knees to her chest. Her room was quiet, save for the occasional sound of crickets outside. The loneliness crept in, wrapping around her like a cold embrace. Her eyes drifted toward the letter from Isaac, still on her bedside table. She picked it up, running her fingers over the paper before reading it again. Promise me you'll keep smiling, even on the hard days. Tears welled in her eyes. Isaac had loved her, truly loved her, and he had wanted her to be happy. Could she allow herself that happiness? The next morning she found herself standing outside David's door. She knocked once, twice, and then the door swung open. David blinked in surprise, his hair slightly tousled as if he had just woken up. Sandy. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. Can we take a walk? A small smile touched his lips. Of course. They walked in silence for a while, the early morning breeze cooling their skin. The town was just waking up, shopkeepers setting up their stalls, the smell of akara and puff-puff filling the air. Sandy took a deep breath. I don't know if I'll ever stop missing Isaac. David glanced at her but didn't say anything, letting her continue. I don't know if I'll ever love someone the same way again. Still, he remained silent, listening. But I think I want to try. I think I want to see where this goes. David stopped walking, turning to face her fully. Are you sure? She nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. No, but I want to try. He studied her for a long moment before reaching for her hand, gently intertwining their fingers. That's all that matters, he said softly, and for the first time in a long time, Sandy felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Just as Sandy was beginning to find peace, the past found her again. It started with a phone call. She had been in the market selecting fresh vegetables when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but something in her gut told her to answer. Hello? A moment of silence, then Sandy. Her blood ran cold. She hadn't heard that voice in over a year. It was Amika Isaac's childhood best friend. She felt her throat tighten. Amika? Yeah, it's been a while, he said awkwardly. What do you want? Her voice was sharper than she intended. He hesitated. I'm back in town. I was hoping we could talk. Sandy exhaled sharply. Amika had been like a brother to Isaac, and once he had been a close friend to her too. But after Isaac's death, he had disappeared, left town without a word. And now, he was back. She wasn't sure she was ready for this conversation, but something told her she needed to have it. Okay, she said finally. Let's meet. Later that evening, they sat across from each other at a small cafe, the tension between them thick. You disappeared, Sandy said, cutting straight to the point. Amika sighed, rubbing his face. I know. I should have been there for you, but He exhaled. I couldn't handle it. Isaac was like a brother to me, and when he died, I didn't know how to face you, face his family, face any of it, so I ran. Sandy crossed her arms. And now you're back. Why? He hesitated before speaking. I needed to make things right. I needed to apologize, not just to you, but to Mama Isaac too. She studied him, searching for sincerity in his eyes. He looked older, more worn out, as if guilt had been eating at him for months. She'd like that, Sandy said finally. She still talks about you. Emeka's lips twitched into a small smile. I miss her. I miss all of you. For a long moment they sat in silence, the weight of the past between them. Sandy realized then that grief had affected everyone differently. She had buried herself in isolation. Emeka had run, and yet here they were, trying to piece their lives back together. Maybe healing wasn't just about letting go. Maybe it was also about making amends. And maybe, just maybe, the past didn't have to haunt them forever. As the weeks passed, Sandy's relationship with David grew stronger. They spent more time together, long walks, deep conversations, quiet moments of understanding. But even as happiness seeped back into her life, she found herself at a crossroads. One evening, as she sat with David outside his apartment, he turned to her. "Sandy," he began cautiously, "what do you want for your future?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've spent so much time grieving that I never really thought about what comes next." David nodded. "I ask because I'm considering leaving town." Sandy's heart lurched. "What?" "I got an offer in Lagos," he explained. "A good one, but I don't want to make any decisions without talking to you first." Sandy felt like the air had been knocked from her lungs. David had become such an important part of her life. Could she handle losing him too? But at the same time, she knew she couldn't ask him to stay if it meant giving up an opportunity. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David looked at her, his gaze soft. "I want you, Sandy, but I also want you to be sure. I don't want you to feel pressured into anything." Tears pricked her eyes. She had lost Isaac in an instant. And now she had a choice. Hold on to fear or take a chance on love again. She took a deep breath. "Then I'm coming with you." David's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" Sandy nodded. "Yes. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I don't want to let fear control me anymore." David's face broke into a smile, and he pulled her into a tight embrace. For the first time in a long time, Sandy wasn't just surviving. She was choosing to live. The decision had been made. Sandy was leaving. It still felt surreal, the idea of packing up her life and moving to Lagos with David. It wasn't something she had planned. It wasn't something she had even considered a few months ago. But now, standing in front of her small wardrobe, folding her clothes into a suitcase, she knew it was the right choice. She was ready, but before she could move forward, she had to say goodbye. The hardest goodbye would be to Mama Isaac. That evening, she made her way to Isaac's family home. As she approached the front door, she felt her heart pounding in her chest. How would Mama Isaac take the news? Would she see it as Sandy abandoning Isaac's memory? She knocked softly, and Mama Isaac opened the door with a warm smile. "My daughter," she greeted, "you came just in time. I made okra soup." Sandy chuckled. "You always know the way to my heart." As they sat down to eat, Sandy took a deep breath. "Mama, there's something I need to tell you." Mama Isaac set down her spoon, looking at her with concern. "I'm leaving," Sandy said, her voice gentle but firm. "David got a job in Lagos, and I've decided to go with him." For a moment, the older woman was silent. Sandy held her breath, waiting. Then Mama Isaac reached across the table and took her hands. "You have my blessing." Sandy's eyes widened. "You're not upset?" Mama Isaac shook her head. "My dear, life is not meant to be lived in one place. You have carried so much pain, but I see now that you are healing. Isaac would want you to live, to love, to find happiness again." Tears welled in Sandy's eyes. "I'll never forget him." "I know," Mama Isaac said softly. "But loving again does not mean forgetting. It means you are carrying his love with you as you move forward." Sandy broke down in tears, and Mama Isaac pulled her into an embrace, holding her like a mother would. It was the closure she hadn't realized she needed. The day of departure came faster than she expected. Her bags were packed, the apartment was empty, and everything she had known was now behind her. As she stood outside the building, taking one last look, David placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded. "Yeah." There was just one last thing she needed to do. She reached into her suitcase and pulled out the wedding dress. David watched as she unfolded it, running her fingers over the fabric one last time. Then, without hesitation, she walked over to the orphanage down the street. A kind woman, Sister Amaka, greeted her with a smile. "Sandy." How are you? I'm good, she said, her voice steady. I have something for you. She handed over the dress. Sister Amaka's eyes widened. This is beautiful. I want it to go to someone who needs it, Sandy said. Someone who is starting their own journey. The woman beamed. Thank you. This will mean so much to a young bride who has nothing. As Sandy walked away, she felt lighter. She wasn't erasing her past. She was giving it new meaning. David was waiting by the car, watching her with admiration. What? She asked, smiling. Nothing, he said, shaking his head. I just think you're incredible. She laughed softly, feeling warmth spread through her chest. As they drove off, leaving behind the town that had shaped her, Sandy realized something. Grief had been a part of her story, but it wasn't the end of it. She had chosen love, she had chosen faith, she had chosen to live. And for the first time in a long time, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The end.